13 months ago, my mother ended a quiet family dinner with a single sentence, but the real problem started before she even opened her mouth to speak. The small blue ledger hiding under my mother's dinner plate was far too thick to just be a grocery list, and its worn, faux leather cover smelled faintly of the cheap peppermint candies they kept in glass bowls at the local bank. I felt its stiff spine pressing against my knuckles when I reached across the table for my water glass. After 15 years running logistics for the United States Army, you develop a radar for things that are out of place. That book did not belong on a dining table, and my mother kept adjusting her placemat to make sure it stayed hidden. Then her silver fork clinked sharply against the fine china. After 15 years in the Army, you are still not half the woman your sister is, my mother said. She wiped her mouth with a cloth napkin and set it down precisely next to the hidden ledger. I looked across the serving dish of roast beef and potatoes. Amber sat there in complete silence. My 33-year-old sister wore a faint, satisfied smile that told me she had heard this exact comparison before. She took a slow sip of her wine and let the insult hang in the air. At the head of the table, my father, George, kept his eyes glued to his peas. He hated conflict more than he loved the truth, and he had spent 4 decades letting his wife dictate the reality of our household. I was 37 years old. I held the rank of major. I commanded hundreds of soldiers and managed supply chains worth millions of dollars. I did not need to sit in my childhood home and beg for a scrap of maternal approval. I did not cry, and I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I simply reached into my uniform jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. The glass screen felt cold against my thumb as I opened my banking application. I navigated to the recurring transfers page, found the one labeled rent assistance, and pressed cancel. Then let her keep a roof over your head, I said. I admit I wanted the words to sting Amber. I wanted my younger sister to know that her pristine image as the perfect daughter was heavily subsidized by my military paycheck. My father finally looked up from his plate, and his face had gone completely pale. "What transfer?" he asked. My mother dropped her fork. It hit the edge of her plate and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. She lunged forward to grab it, but her elbow caught the edge of her placemat. The blue ledger slid off the polished wood table and landed right at my feet. I leaned down and picked it up before she could reach it. The book fell open to a page dated just 3 days prior. I only had a few seconds to process what I was looking at, but the ink was clear. There were 2 distinct columns drawn down the center of the page. One was labeled with an M, and the other was labeled with an A. Next to the M was the exact dollar amount I sent them on the 1st of every single month. Next to the A was a smaller number, followed by a note about pharmacy receipts. My mother snatched the book from my hands and held it tight against her chest. "Those are just my grocery notes," she snapped. Her knuckles were white from gripping the leather cover. I committed the columns to memory, but I did not push the issue yet because Amber was staring at me from across the table. The smug smile had completely vanished from her face. "What money are you talking about?" Amber asked. Her voice lacked its usual confidence, and she placed her wine glass down so hard the liquid sloshed over the rim. "The $3,200 I send every month," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I have been paying their rent for 18 months. Amber shook her head back and forth. "No. Mom told me you never sent a dime because you resented them for moving to Ohio. I am the one paying for things. I send $1,800 every month for Dad's heart medication and the groceries." The dining room went completely silent. You could hear the low hum of the refrigerator running in the kitchen. My father looked back and forth between his 2 daughters. He pressed a hand against his chest, right over the spot where he had his minor heart procedure a 1.5 years ago. "My pension and my Social Security cover the rent," he whispered. "The rent is paid from our joint household account. It always has been." My mother stood up from her chair. She smoothed her skirt and forced a laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "You girls misunderstood," she said, waving her hand as if she were clearing away smoke. "The money was a gift. Your father is a proud man, and his pride was hurting when he had to retire early. I kept it quiet so I would not hurt him." "You told me Melissa abandoned us," Amber said. Her voice trembled just a fraction. "I was protecting the family," the woman who raised us replied. She did not look at Amber. Instead, she pointed a rigid finger directly at me. "And you come in here treating our dinner table like one of your military interrogations. You could not wait to ruin a nice evening. Amber at least knows how to help her parents without humiliating them." I looked at the woman clutching the blue book to her chest. "Show us the lease and the joint bank account," I said. She lifted her chin and glared at me. "Absolutely not. I will not be audited in my own home by a daughter who only shows up twice a year." I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair. There was no point in arguing with a closed door, and I had enough logistical experience to know when a supply line was entirely compromised. I walked toward the front hallway, fully expecting my father to stop me. George trailed behind me, wringing his hands together, but he did not step in front of my mother to demand the truth. He never did. "Drive safe, Melissa," he finally mumbled while staring at his shoes. "Check your bank statements, Dad," I replied, and I walked out into the cool Ohio night. The drive to my hotel took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my joints ache. I had spent a year and a half believing my money proved I was a good daughter. I had used those monthly transfers to buy my way out of making uncomfortable phone calls and visiting a house where I was always the second best option. It was easier to throw $3,200 at a problem than to sit in that townhouse and be compared to Amber. As I watched the streetlights flash over the hood of my car, I realized I had absolutely no idea how my father was actually surviving. I parked in the hotel lot and turned off the engine. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text message from Amber. She had sent a clear photograph of her bank statement. I opened the image and counted 18 separate transfers, each for $1,800, going straight into a checking account that only had our mother's name on it. I pulled up my own banking history, took a screenshot of my $3,200 transfers, and sent it back to her without a single word of explanation. A few seconds later, 3 gray dots appeared on the screen. My sister and I were finally looking at the exact same math. $5,000 a month had been disappearing into our mother's private account for a year and a half, and neither of us had bothered to verify the stories we were told. Amber sent another message. "Mom told me you abandoned us when Dad got sick." I typed my reply carefully. "She told me you were carrying all of the weight and that I needed to pay the rent so you could afford his pills." We had spent 8 years throwing quiet insults at each other at every holiday gathering. I had called her a part-time daughter because she lived in the same city but complained about the burden. She had called me a weekend soldier because I chose my career over coming home for Thanksgiving. Every single resentment between us had been carefully watered and trimmed by the woman who needed us to stay angry at each other. If we were fighting, we were not comparing notes. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the plastic console. Amber asked the only question that mattered now. "Then what exactly have we been paying for?" I did not have an answer. I stared at the dark dashboard of my car and listened to the engine tick as it cooled down. The wind rattled the bare branches of a nearby oak tree, scraping them against the brick wall of the hotel. I thought about the blue ledger. I thought about the neat columns marked M and A, and the way my mother had guarded that book like it was a loaded weapon. Then a final text message came through, illuminating the dark car with a bright white glare. "I just checked Dad's old emails," Amber wrote. "His pension started 19 months ago." I read the words twice to make sure my eyes were not playing tricks on me in the dark. If his pension had started a full month before I sent my very first transfer, then the story about them being short on rent had been a lie from the exact moment it left her mouth. We were not just dealing with a mother who played favorites to get a little extra spending money. We were dealing with a ghost account, a massive hole in the ground, and a woman who had orchestrated two separate realities to fund it. I locked my car doors and started walking toward the hotel entrance. The shock was already fading, replaced by a cold, familiar clarity. I was going to find out exactly where our $5,000 a month had gone, and I was not going to pay another dime for my place in that family. 2 stacks of paper sat on the scratched laminate table. The coffee shop on the corner of Elm and Fourth smelled like bitter espresso and burnt sugar, and a cold draft swept over my ankles every time the front door opened. I took a sip of black coffee and watched my younger sister slide into the booth opposite me. Amber did not unbutton her wool coat. She kept her purse securely on her lap, clutching the leather strap with both hands. We had intentionally chosen a neutral location, a place exactly halfway between her house and my hotel. Neither of us wanted to meet at the townhouse where our mother was currently holding court. My sister looked at the bank statements I had fanned out across the table. Her jaw tightened, and she pulled her own manila folder from her bag, setting it down with a heavy thud. "You always sent money instead of calling," Amber said. Her voice carried the defensive edge she had perfected over the last 8 years. "You never checked on Dad. You just threw a paycheck at the problem so you could stay in Kentucky and play soldier." I set my mug down. The ceramic clicked loudly against the tabletop. "I did not visit because every time I walked through the front door you stood right next to her while she tore my career apart. I paid the rent because I thought it would buy me a quiet holiday." Amber looked away, watching a barista wipe down the counter. We both knew my accusation held weight. She had enjoyed the title of the good daughter for a very long time, and my absence had made her role much easier to maintain. But we were not here to apologize. We were here to dissect a financial slaughter. "Let us just look at the dates," I told her. I pulled a yellow legal pad from my bag and uncapped my pen. For the next hour, we built a timeline of 18 months of pure deception. I read the date of a transfer, and Amber checked her corresponding records. The math revealed a system so precise it belonged in a tactical manual. Whenever our mother requested $3,200 from me to cover a sudden rent increase, she waited exactly 2 days before calling Amber. The second call always carried a different emergency: a change in our father and his pharmacy copay, a broken water heater, a sudden grocery deficit. Same week, 2 different crises, 2 separate deposits into the same checking account. "She asked me for money on the 4th of October, Amber whispered, tracing a line on her statement. "She told me Dad needed a new specialist out of pocket." I checked my ledger. I sent her $3,000 on the 2nd of October because she claimed the landlord was imposing a penalty fee. We stared at the dual columns of numbers. A strange, quiet solidarity settled over the booth. We were no longer the favored child and the absent disappointment. We were simply 2 marks who had been systematically drained by the woman who raised us. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the espresso machine. My father walked inside. He looked exhausted, his shoulders hunched inside a jacket that seemed a size too big for him. When he saw us sitting together without our mother mediating the space between us, he stopped walking for a fraction of a second. Then he approached the booth and slid in next to Amber. He placed a thick brown envelope on top of our scattered bank statements. "I went to the bank this morning," George said. His voice sounded thin and raspy. "The teller helped me print the history for the joint household account." I pulled the documents from the envelope. I did not ask how my mother had reacted to him leaving the house, and I did not ask if she knew he was here. We needed facts, not domestic drama. I flipped to the first page and scanned the debit column. There it was. A consistent automated deduction made on the 1st of every single month, labeled with the name of the property management company. "The rent was paid from the joint account," I said, tapping the paper. "It has always been paid from the joint account." My father nodded slowly, staring down at his weathered hands. My pension and my Social Security deposits have always been enough to cover the rent, the utilities, and the insurance. I never read the paper statements when they came in the mail. Your mother always handled the mail. I just checked the mobile application to make sure the rent cleared, and then I let her manage the rest." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for a pardon. He wanted me to tell him it was a simple mistake. He wanted me to say he had done his best and that none of this was his fault. I did not give him that comfort. "You let her control the flow of information for 40 years, I said. Amber flinched, but she did not defend him. My sister crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "I spent half my weekends driving you to the clinic," she told our father. "I gave up my free time to help, and Mom used that to tell me I was the only one who cared. She used my exhaustion to make me hate Melissa." "I am not denying your effort, Amber," I replied quietly. "You put the time in, but you also used that time as a weapon. You loved being the one who stayed behind." My sister flushed deep red. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. For the first time in a decade, we were speaking directly to each other without our mother translating the conversation to serve her own narrative. "We need to secure the perimeter," I said, shifting back to the documents. "I have exactly 4 days of approved leave before I have to return to Fort Knox. I cannot fix this for you, Dad. You have to take action today." George swallowed hard. "What do I do?" "You need to reroute your pension deposit immediately," I instructed. "Open a new checking account at a completely different bank. Do not put her name on it. Do not tell her the account number. Then you need to call a financial advisor and freeze your credit profile." The old man looked terrified at the prospect of defying his wife, but the weight of $5,000 missing dollars a month finally anchored him to reality. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "The bank manager already helped me pull my credit report this morning," George murmured. He handed the folded page across the table. I smoothed the paper out next to my coffee cup. Amber leaned over my shoulder to read the fine print. The first page showed his current auto loan, completely standard. But the second page contained a block of text that made the hairs on my arms stand up. 3 active accounts sat glaringly in the open column. There was a high-interest personal loan and 2 platinum credit cards, all opened within the last 18 months. The total outstanding balance across all 3 accounts dwarfed the money Amber and I had been sending combined. "I have never seen those accounts in my life," my father whispered. His hands began to shake, rattling the table slightly. "I never signed for a personal loan." I traced my finger along the origination details. The contact phone number was listed, along with a partially masked email address. The first letter and the domain name were fully visible, matching the exact format of the email account our mother used for her online shopping. "This is no longer just a family dispute about stolen rent money," I said. The words tasted like ash. "Someone used your Social Security number to secure a loan." George pulled the paper closer to his face, squinting at the digital signature printed at the bottom of the loan application record. He stared at the date stamped next to the forged script, the color completely drained from his cheeks. He traced the printed date with a trembling index finger. "That signature cannot be mine," my father said. The air in the coffee shop seemed to freeze around us. My right hand was still in a heavy medical brace when this loan was opened. The civilian attorney slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany table, and the heavy paper rasped against the wood. Her name was Davis, and her office smelled like lemon polish and expensive leather, a sharp contrast to the stale diner coffee Amber and I had consumed 2 days earlier. My father sat between us, staring at the dispute packet the lender had finally provided. His shoulders hunched forward, making him look frail inside his heavy winter coat. I reached out and opened the folder. The loan application sat right on top, printed in stark black ink, detailing a financial reality that simply did not exist. The document claimed George Grant earned $80,000 a year in independent consulting fees, a complete fabrication. Below the false income statement, A contact phone number was listed for verification purposes. I recognized the digits immediately. It was the cell phone number my mother had used for the last 10 years. But the most damning evidence rested at the very bottom of the page, right next to a digital timestamp. An electronic signature bore my father's full name, dated exactly 8 months ago. "That signature is impossible," my father whispered, tracing the printed date with a trembling index finger. The old man looked up at Attorney Davis, his eyes wide and panicked. My right hand was completely immobilized in a heavy medical brace that entire month. The surgeon explicitly forbade me from holding a pen or typing on a keyboard. The attorney folded her hands carefully on the desk and nodded. "That physical impossibility is an excellent piece of evidence, George, but a bank will not just take your word for it. They need a formal dispute, and that requires declaring the loan fraudulent." Amber shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, her heavy purse resting on her lap. She looked at our father, then at the forged document. "Did you ask Mom about it?" she asked softly. "Did you actually show her the credit report?" George swallowed hard and pulled his coat tighter around himself. He admitted he had driven back to the townhouse the previous evening, hoping for a simple misunderstanding. He told us how the woman who raised us had greeted him at the door wearing her favorite apron. She had spent the entire afternoon cooking his favorite pot roast, filling the small house with the smell of rosemary and roasted garlic. She had even lit the expensive candles they usually saved for their wedding anniversary, setting a perfectly domestic stage before he could even open his mouth to ask about the missing $5,000 a month. When he finally placed the credit report on the dining table, the pristine illusion shattered. "She did not deny taking the money," George explained, his voice cracking. "She burst into tears and claimed she had only borrowed the funds within the family to keep us afloat. She swore I had given her permission to handle the finances before my heart procedure. And when I asked her about the personal loan, she refused to look at the paper. She just changed the subject and started screaming about Melissa." My phone vibrated violently against the conference table, cutting my father off. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. A lengthy text message had just arrived from my aunt, my father's older sister. The message did not ask how George was feeling or inquire about the sudden family tension. Instead, a wall of aggressive text accused me of using military interrogation tactics on an elderly, frightened woman. My mother had clearly spent her morning calling every relative in Ohio, weaving a narrative where I had spitefully cut off their financial support simply to punish a sick old man. She painted herself as the terrified victim of a cold, disciplined soldier who possessed absolutely no empathy. My jaw tightened until my teeth ached. A familiar heat flared in my chest, the kind of absolute fury that demands an immediate public correction. I opened my keyboard, ready to draft a response detailing the forged loan, the fake rent emergency, and the stolen thousands. Attorney Davis reached across the table and tapped the back of my phone. "I would advise against sending anything right now," she said, keeping her voice completely neutral. "Engaging in a smear campaign gives the opposing party ammunition to claim harassment. Document the message, save the timestamp, and leave it unanswered." I hated the advice, but the logic was perfectly sound. I locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the table, choosing silence over satisfaction. That restraint cost me my sleep for the next 48 hours. The tension followed me all the way down Interstate 71 as I drove back to Fort Knox the following morning. I needed to wrap up a quarterly logistics cycle before I could take extended time off, but my focus remained completely shattered. Standing in front of a brightly lit digital map board in the command briefing room, I found myself staring at supply chain metrics while thinking about the forged signature on that application. I pointed to a column detailing transport schedules for a mechanized infantry unit, advancing the delivery date by 24 hours. "Ma'am," a junior officer spoke up from the second row, clearing his throat nervously. "If we advance that convoy, They will arrive before the supply depot officially opens on Tuesday morning." The room went entirely silent. I looked at the digital board, realizing I had just misaligned a massive transport schedule because my mind was trapped in a civilian attorney's office in Ohio. A wave of deep professional embarrassment washed over me. For 15 years, absolute precision had been my armor. My mother had spent my entire adult life calling me an unfeeling machine, and now her deception was making me fail at the one thing I was actually good at. "You are entirely correct, Lieutenant," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I adjusted the digital marker back to its proper place, effectively fixing the error. I turned to my deputy commander and handed him the laser pointer. "Please take over the remainder of this briefing." I did not make excuses, and I did not try to hide the mistake. I walked straight down the linoleum hallway to my commanding officer's suite, knocked on the heavy wooden door, and requested a formal meeting. I explained that an urgent family legal matter involving financial fraud required my immediate attention, and I submitted the paperwork for a 2-week authorized leave. The commander approved it without hesitation, reminding me to keep my military authority completely separate from my civilian disputes. The boundary was clear, and it protected my career from the exact accusations my mother was currently spreading to our extended relatives. I packed a heavy duffel bag in my quiet apartment that evening, preparing for the drive back to Columbus. My laptop chimed from the kitchen counter. Amber had forwarded an audio file to my email, along with a short message asking me to listen carefully. I connected my headphones and clicked play. It was a saved voicemail from 5 months ago. Our mother's voice filled my ears, carrying that practiced, breathless tone she always used when she needed a favor. She was asking Amber for an extra $600, claiming my father needed an emergency dental procedure that insurance refused to cover, but the request itself was not the important part. Behind her voice, a faint electronic melody played in the background. It was a repetitive, high-pitched chime, followed by the distinctive sound of digital coins dropping into a virtual tray. It sounded exactly like an online slot machine application. A sharp intake of breath interrupted the digital noise, and then the woman who raised us muttered a rushed phrase to someone off camera, completely forgetting she was leaving a voicemail. "Come on," she whispered, the desperation heavy in her throat. "Just let it spin. I can win it back." I stopped the recording and checked the file metadata, logging the exact date and time it was created. It was not a full confession, and it did not prove she had committed identity theft, but it finally offered a destination for the thousands of dollars that had vanished from our bank accounts. 2 days later, the three of us sat in Attorney Davis's office for the second time that week. The air conditioning hummed loudly over our heads, struggling against the humid Ohio afternoon. A single document rested in the center of the table. It was an official identity theft report, printed on crisp white paper, requiring a final signature at the bottom. The attorney leaned forward, folding her hands neatly together. "George, if you want to dispute this loan and protect your remaining assets, you have to sign this report. We cannot go to the lender and claim forgery while simultaneously refusing to name the person who had unauthorized access to your information." The old man stared at the blank signature line. "You are asking me to file a police report against my wife of 40 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will they arrest her today?" "Filing this report triggers an investigation," the attorney clarified patiently. "It allows us to subpoena device records, lender logs, and authentication histories. An investigation takes months, George. It does not mean an immediate conviction, but it is the only way to stop the financial bleeding." My father looked at Amber, and then he looked at me. He had spent his entire marriage avoiding conflict, choosing the quiet comfort of ignorance over the difficult reality of confrontation. He had let my mother pit his daughters against each other because stepping in would have disrupted his peaceful evenings. I did not push him, and I did not offer him a comfortable lie. I simply waited. Finally, George picked up the heavy metal pen provided by the attorney. His hand shook terribly, but he pressed the ink to the paper and signed his real name, officially documenting the theft. A heavy silence settled over the room as the lawyer notarized the signature. We had crossed an invisible line, turning a private family tragedy into a formal legal battlefield. Amber shifted in her chair and pulled her phone from her purse, intending to check the time. The screen lit up with a new notification. My sister stared at the device, and all the color drained from her face in an instant. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "Mom went back to the townhouse this morning," Amber said, her voice shaking violently. "The neighbor just texted me. The blue ledger is gone." Amber stared at her phone screen, and her breathing became shallow and fast. The text message from the neighbor sat there like a live grenade, claiming our mother had returned to the townhouse and the ledger was missing. My father reached into the deep pocket of his winter coat, pulled out a familiar object bound in worn blue faux leather, and placed it gently on the conference table. "She did not take it," George said softly, looking at the book. "Because I found it this morning before I left the house." Attorney Davis leaned forward, instantly alert to the legal implications, and asked exactly where the item had been located. She warned us that searching through private bags could compromise the evidence, but my father shook his head. George explained he had discovered the book sitting in the shared kitchen drawer right next to the utility bills and grocery receipts. He had taken a photograph of its exact position with his phone before placing it in his coat. The chain of custody remained perfectly clean, so the attorney nodded in approval before opening the cover. The pages crackled dryly as the lawyer turned them, and the faint scent of peppermint candy still lingered on the paper. The handwritten ink detailed a financial operation that stripped away any remaining illusion of a loving family. Every single date matched the banking transfers Amber and I had documented. Next to my $3,200 deposits, my mother had drawn a tiny house symbol to mark the fake rent story. Next to the money from Amber, a small medical cross indicated the fabricated pharmacy expenses. Further down the page, a new notation caught my attention. A capital letter G sat next to a large withdrawal, perfectly matching the date of the slot machine noises from the recorded voicemail. Looking at my own name reduced to a single initial, the truth finally crystallized. I was never a daughter in that house. I was simply a logistical resource, managed and deployed whenever the gambling debts grew too large. The numbers were devastating, but the margins contained something much worse. Attorney Davis paused on a page near the middle of the book, and her professional composure faltered for a fraction of a second. She turned the ledger around so Amber and I could read the neat cursive handwriting. The woman who raised us had written a manual on how to control her own children. M equals money, the first line read. A equals care, the second line stated. Below those definitions, a series of behavioral instructions mapped out our entire adult lives. Do not praise both on the same day. If they speak, use Dad's health to distract. M needs to feel useful. A needs to feel chosen. My sister let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. The title of the good daughter, the crown she had worn with such pride for a decade, was nothing but a calculated piece of bait. Amber pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor, and she walked out of the office without a single word. I found her in the quiet hallway near the restrooms, bathed in the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights. She was leaning against the cool plaster wall, staring blankly at the beige carpet. We had spent years circling each other like enemies, and now the architect of our war had been fully exposed. I reminded her of the Thanksgiving she called me a holiday daughter, and Amber countered by bringing up the time I told her some of us had real careers. Those insults had been genuine, and we had actually said them. However, our mother had taken those isolated moments of sibling frustration, exaggerated them into massive betrayals, and repeated them constantly to make sure the wounds never healed. "I am sorry for dismissing your caregiving," I told my sister, keeping my voice steady. "I treated your time at the clinic like it was less important than my deployments, and that was wrong. My sister crossed her arms defensively, and her knuckles turned white against her coat. She did not offer a full apology in return, and she still looked ready to fight, but the absolute certainty in her eyes was finally gone. We agreed to focus on the documents and walked back into the room together. George was holding the ledger close to his face when we returned, pointing a shaking finger at a paragraph near the back cover. If G asks about the missing savings, say M insisted on secrecy, my father read aloud. He swallowed hard and moved to the next line. If the personal loan appears on the mail, say G approved it before his heart surgery and simply forgot. The old man set the book down on the polished wood. His wife had not just stolen his identity. She had also prepared a complete narrative to blame his eldest daughter for the missing cash, and she planned to use his medical vulnerability to convince him his memory was failing regarding the fraudulent debt. The passive silence he had maintained for 40 years finally broke. George looked at the attorney and stated he was packing his clothes tonight, refusing to spend another hour living in that townhouse. My cell phone began vibrating on the table, and the caller identification displayed my mother's number. She had obviously realized the book was gone, so the panic was finally setting in. I answered the call and put the device on speaker, so the attorney could hear every word. "You have absolutely no right to take my private therapy journal," the familiar voice snapped through the tiny speaker, skipping any greeting. "You are invading my privacy." I did not read the cruel entries back to her, and I refused to engage in a screaming match. I looked at the 2 columns of numbers and asked a single quiet question. "Why did you need us not to speak to each other?" A heavy pause stretched over the cellular connection. When she finally answered, her voice took on that tight, breathless quality she used during church meetings. "Because every family needs one person who keeps things together," she said, genuinely believing her own twisted logic. "You kept us apart," I replied, and I ended the call. Attorney Davis pulled the ledger closer to her keyboard, tapping a silver pen against a series of digits written beneath the gambling withdrawal date. "This notation here," the lawyer said, looking up at the 3 of us. I leaned over the table, studying the 4 numbers scribbled in the margin. "What is it?" George asked, his voice tight with new anxiety. "It is an account number," she confirmed, and none of us had any idea who it belonged to. Several weeks had passed since we secured the blue ledger from the kitchen drawer, and the slow, grinding machinery of legal discovery had finally produced a yield. The civilian forensic accountant adjusted his silver spectacles and placed a thick printed spreadsheet onto the glass conference table. His name was Sterling, and Attorney Davis had recommended his firm to trace the missing funds. We had spent the last 2 months waiting for the subpoenas and official requests to force the financial institutions to open their doors. Now, the heavy stack of paper sitting in front of us held the answers. Sterling uncapped a black pen and pointed to the top row of the document. The 4 isolated digits we had found, scribbled in the margins of the blue ledger, perfectly matched the ending sequence of a private checking account. My mother had opened it under her name alone, operating it entirely outside the boundaries of my parents' marriage. "The money did not simply disappear into thin air," Sterling said, his voice carrying the calm detachment of a man who looked at financial ruins every single day. It moved in a very specific, deliberate pattern. George leaned forward, staring at the dense columns of black and red numbers, and he asked where the initial deficit came from. He wanted to know what event had triggered the massive need for cash. Sterling flipped to a historical view of the joint household savings account, tracing a line back to a date over 2 years ago. "A massive withdrawal occurred right before your minor heart procedure," the accountant explained. "The funds were transferred out of the secure savings and wired directly to a limited liability company operating under the name Senior Income Club." My father pressed a trembling hand over his mouth, blinking rapidly as he processed the information. "Beverly brought a glossy brochure for that club home from a church luncheon," George whispered, his eyes never leaving the paper. She wanted us to invest a large portion of our retirement to generate passive income. I explicitly told her it sounded like a predatory scam, and I refused to authorize the transfer. I trusted her, so I never bothered to check the savings balance after that conversation. The woman who raised us had fallen for a sophisticated investment scheme, and she had lost a significant portion of their safety net in a single afternoon. Instead of admitting the catastrophic mistake to her husband, she had tried to fix it quietly. That initial shame explained the beginning of the deception, but it absolutely did not excuse the systematic exploitation of her own children that followed. Sterling traced the flow of the incoming deposits with his pen. Once the savings were gone, she needed to replace the missing capital quickly, and that is exactly when the online gambling started. Amber shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, her eyes tracking the colored lines on the spreadsheet. So she used the $5,000 a month we sent her to place bets on her phone? My sister asked. Not entirely, the accountant replied. The monthly transfers you and Melissa provided served three distinct purposes, keeping her entire operation afloat. A portion covered the minimum monthly payments on the fraudulent personal loan and the hidden credit card she had opened in your father's name. Another portion fed directly into the gambling platform to chase her previous losses, hoping for a miracle jackpot. Sterling tapped a third, highly detailed column. The final portion was used to maintain her public image. I pulled the paper closer to read the itemized merchant names. The list contained charges for expensive floral arrangements, luxury dinners at the local country club, and generous financial donations to various community fundraisers. My mother had used the rent money I sent to play the role of a wealthy charitable matriarch in her social circle. She had publicly accepted praise for her profound generosity, while privately telling Amber and me that our parents were on the absolute brink of eviction. A cold, precise anger tightened my chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out my cell phone, gripping the smooth glass tightly. I wanted to take a clear photograph of that spreadsheet and send it to every single aunt, uncle, and cousin living in Columbus. I wanted to burn her pristine public reputation to ash before the sun went down. I am sending this directly to the family group chat, I said, unlocking the screen with my thumb. Amber reached across the table and clamped her hand firmly over my wrist. Do not do it, Melissa. I glared at my younger sister, fully expecting her to defend our mother out of some lingering sense of loyalty. She is buying expensive flowers for her friends with my paycheck while calling me a selfish daughter, I snapped. And the formal investigation is not finished yet, Amber replied, her voice remarkably steady and commanding. If you blast this out to the family right now, Mom will just claim it is a fake document generated by a bitter child, and you will look like a crazy person trying to ruin her life. We have to wait for the prosecutor to build the case. I stared at Amber, and the absolute truth of her statement washed over me. For my entire adult life, I had viewed my sister as an undisciplined emotional liability who could not handle complex situations. Yet in this crucial moment, she was the one holding the line. She was protecting our legal strategy, actively keeping me from making a massive tactical error driven purely by spite. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket, offering a short nod of acknowledgement. Amber unzipped her heavy leather purse and retrieved a small silver thumb drive. She placed it carefully next to the accountant's spreadsheet, and the metal clicked softly against the glass table. I brought the original voicemail file, she told the room. The one with the casino game noises playing in the background. I did not edit it. I knew exactly what that meant, and the gravity of her action was not lost on me. Amber had previously hesitated to share the complete audio file because it captured a conversation where our mother mocked my military service, referring to me as a weekend soldier. In the unedited recording, my sister could be heard laughing in agreement with the insult. Handing over the intact file was a complete surrender of her pride. It was her first, genuine, tangible step toward accountability. Attorney Davis picked up the drive and promised to submit it to the investigators to authenticate the timeline. I watched my sister take a shaky breath, clearly waiting for me to offer a grand declaration of forgiveness. I did not give her one, because trust takes much longer than a single afternoon to rebuild, but I did pour her a glass of ice water from the pitcher on the table and pushed it toward her. It was a start. Suddenly, a sharp digital chime echoed through the quiet office. My father jumped slightly in his seat, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out his mobile phone and the bright screen illuminated his pale, tired face. He had set up new security alerts on the joint checking account immediately after our meeting at the coffee shop, following my strict logistical instructions. "It is a bank notification," George said, his voice thick with confusion. "Someone just initiated an electronic transfer to move the entire remaining balance of the joint account into an external holding fund." Because George had formally disputed the fraudulent loan and changed the fundamental security protocols, the bank had automatically placed a temporary hold on the transaction. The money was effectively frozen in transit, pending a verbal authorization from the primary account holder. 10 seconds later, his phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed my mother's contact photograph, showing her smiling brightly at a church picnic. George looked at the ringing device, his thumb hovering nervously over the red decline button. "Answer it," Attorney Davis instructed calmly, leaning back in her chair. "Put the call on speaker and absolutely do not agree to release anything." My father pressed the green icon and placed the phone on the glass table. "Hello, Beverly." "George, honey." The familiar, breathless voice filled the room. The low hum of road noise in the background suggested she was driving in her car. "The bank is experiencing a terrible technical glitch today. They are holding up a routine transfer I need to make. I need you to call customer service right now and tell them to release the funds immediately. It is my money, George, and I need it for groceries." My father looked down at the forensic spreadsheet detailing the thousands of dollars she had stolen from their retirement and the massive debt she had opened in his name. His jaw tightened, and he sat up a little straighter in his chair, finally finding the anchor he had been missing for decades. "I am not releasing the funds, Beverly," George stated clearly. "That money needs to stay exactly where it is." The sweet, coaxing tone vanished instantly. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds over the cellular connection before my mother spoke again, and her voice sounded like ice cracking under heavy pressure. "If you choose those ungrateful girls over your own wife, I will tell everyone Melissa forced you to do this," she hissed. "I will tell the whole family she used her military rank to bully a sick old man into stealing my money, and I will report her to her commanding officer." "You can tell them whatever you want," George replied, and he reached out, pressing the red button to end the call. He sat back, breathing heavily, but he did not apologize for hanging up. The man who had spent 40 years avoiding conflict had finally drawn a definitive line in the sand, choosing reality over a peaceful lie. Mr. Sterling gathered the printed pages from the table, stacking them neatly into a fresh manila folder. The accountant cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to his side of the room. He looked at his computer monitor, where a new set of data had just finished downloading from a secured financial portal the investigators had accessed. "There is one more thing you all need to see," Sterling said, turning the large monitor so it faced the 3 of us. I braced myself for another gambling transaction or a hidden credit card, but the screen displayed a completely different set of origination records. "The personal loan we discussed earlier," the accountant stated quietly, adjusting his silver spectacles. "It was not the first account opened in George's name. It was the third." The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing inventory manifests at my desk. My office phone rarely rang for personal matters, but the caller identification displayed the mobile number of my father's older sister. Aunt Clara did not offer a greeting when I answered. She launched straight into a stern lecture, claiming George was currently under severe emotional distress, and she accused me of using my military training to manipulate a sick old man. My mother had clearly escalated her campaign. A formal reconciliation meeting had been scheduled at a local community center in Columbus, and Clara demanded my attendance. Attorney Davis explicitly warned me against arguing the detailed evidence of our ongoing investigation in front of an audience. Her advice was sound, yet I still drove back to Ohio that weekend. I went solely because George asked me to stand beside him when he finally told his family the truth. The rented room at the community center smelled heavily of floor wax and stale coffee. A dozen extended relatives sat in a loose circle of metal folding chairs, looking like a jury preparing to deliver a verdict. Beverly arrived 10 minutes late, ensuring everyone was waiting for her entrance. She wore a simple beige cardigan and clutched a thick manila folder against her chest, performing the role of a terrified, exhausted matriarch to absolute perfection. Taking the center seat, the woman who raised us immediately began to weep softly. She did not confess to identity theft or online gambling. Instead, she claimed she had simply borrowed money within the family to cover mounting medical debts, and she insisted George's memory was failing him regarding the personal loan. To prove my inherent cruelty, she opened her folder and passed around printed copies of text messages I had sent her over the years. She carefully selected messages where I sounded cold, brief, and distinctly logistical, completely stripping them of context. Then she pointed a trembling finger at Amber, declaring her youngest daughter had been tragically brainwashed by an older sister who possessed absolutely no empathy. The room remained painfully quiet, and several aunts nodded in sympathy. Beverly had decades of experience playing the selfless caregiver, so her audience was naturally inclined to believe her narrative. I felt the familiar urge to systematically dismantle her argument. I wanted to list my professional achievements, slam a copy of the Blue Ledger onto the folding table, and expose every single lie. However, doing so would violate my attorney's instructions and turn the legal dispute into a petty screaming match. Instead of fighting her emotional war, I remained in my chair and stated 3 simple, verified facts. I explained that Amber and I had both transferred money based on 2 conflicting stories. The townhouse rent had always been paid by my father's pension, and George's signature on the loan application had been forged while his right hand was immobilized in a medical brace. Beverly's eyes narrowed, dropping the Fragile Victim Act for a fraction of a second. She turned toward the relatives and loudly quoted the terrible thing I had said at the dinner table months ago, reminding everyone I had told my mother to let Amber keep a roof over her head. She wielded my anger like a weapon, hoping to prove I was exactly as vicious as she claimed. I looked across the circle at my younger sister. I did not defend my words. I said that specifically to hurt you, I told Amber, keeping my voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. I used my money to make you feel small, and I am deeply sorry for doing it. Admitting my own fault in front of an audience completely neutralized the attack. Beverly sat frozen in her metal chair, her primary weapon rendered utterly useless by a simple apology. Before my mother could pivot to a new strategy, George slowly stood up. The old man gripped the back of his chair for support, his knuckles turning white under the fluorescent lights. "Melissa did not force me to do anything," my father announced. His voice shook slightly, but the volume filled the quiet room. I filed the police report based on my own decision. I saw the forged signature, and I finally stopped pretending everything was fine. He looked around the circle of relatives, and the heavy shame he had carried for 40 years seemed to finally break. He admitted he had allowed his wife to demean his daughters because he was too much of a coward to endure her temper. Hearing George take active responsibility for his passive silence shifted the atmosphere entirely. 2 of my uncles leaned back in their chairs, clearly withdrawing themselves from the jury box. Desperate to regain control, Beverly turned her attention back to Amber. She demanded her youngest daughter confirm she had always been a good, loving mother who sacrificed everything for her family. My sister did not offer the requested validation. Amber reached into her purse, retrieved her phone, and tapped the screen. A loud, clear audio recording echoed in the community center. It was a short clip of our mother telling Amber I was completely useless and needed to be kept out of the loop. Beverly gasped dramatically, clutching her chest. "That was a private conversation between a mother and a daughter," she shouted, her face flushing a deep crimson. "You used private lies to secure public loyalty," Amber replied calmly, sliding her phone back into her bag. The intervention fractured immediately after that exchange. People began standing up and murmuring awkward excuses, eager to escape the suffocating tension. I gathered my coat and walked toward the exit, needing to breathe real air. A hand clamped down hard on my shoulder just as I reached the hallway door. I turned around and found Beverly blocking my path, her carefully constructed public mask completely shattered. Her eyes were wide, dark, and utterly furious. "If you think you can take my family away from me, you are going to lose everything," she hissed, pressing her finger against the lapel of my jacket. "I will call the military authorities tomorrow morning. I will report that a high-ranking officer is using her position to financially abuse and intimidate an elderly woman. They will believe a frightened mother long before they believe a daughter who never even bothered to come home." I did not raise my voice, and I did not threaten her in return. I pulled a small notebook from my pocket, deliberately wrote down the exact time, and walked out the door without saying a single word. The drive back to Kentucky felt exceptionally long, and I arrived at my apartment long after midnight. I managed a few hours of restless sleep before my alarm sounded, signaling the start of a new operational week. I put on my uniform, secured my hair, and drove to the base, fully expecting the legal situation to remain quiet for a few days. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, my desk phone rang. My commanding officer rarely called my direct extension unless a deployment schedule had been compromised. "Major Grant, please report to my office immediately," the commander instructed. "A formal complaint was just filed regarding your conduct with an elderly civilian family member." The heavy oak door of the commander's office stood slightly ajar, and a sliver of bright fluorescent light spilled onto the hallway floor. I knocked twice, waiting for permission to enter, before stepping onto the pristine carpet. The colonel sat behind his massive mahogany desk, pushing a single printed page across the polished wood. The complaint was a masterpiece of manufactured victimhood. My mother had accused me of leveraging my military rank to terrorize an elderly woman out of her life savings, claiming I was using government resources to orchestrate a personal vendetta. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer a passionate defense of my character. Instead, I unzipped my uniform pocket and handed my superior officer a neat manila folder. It contained my approved leave requests, the civilian identity theft report George had signed, and a brief statement from Attorney Davis confirming the dispute was entirely out of military jurisdiction. The colonel reviewed the documents in complete silence, while the grandfather clock in the corner ticked methodically. Finally, he closed the folder and handed it back to me. He noted that no military resources had been utilized, but he sternly ordered me to keep the civilian dispute entirely separate from my command. Stepping back out into the bright linoleum hallway, the rigid tension in my shoulders finally dropped. Beverly had tried to burn down 15 years of my service, but strict logistical discipline had built a firewall she could not breach. That evening, my father called my cellular phone. His voice carried a heavy, exhausted weight, and he spent 10 minutes apologizing for letting the situation reach this breaking point. George fully expected me to take over the management of his new checking account, essentially seeking a new caretaker to replace his wife. I refused the position immediately. The old man needed to learn how to read his own bank statements and speak directly to his financial advisor. I loved him, but I absolutely refused to become his new manager. Protecting my boundaries meant forcing him to stand on his own 2 feet. The slow machinery of justice continued grinding forward for another month, moving at a glacial pace that tested every ounce of my patience. Then, a highly anticipated email from Attorney Davis lit up my computer monitor, proving that digital footprints are entirely impossible to erase. The subpoenaed authentication records from the personal loan provider had finally arrived, and the civilian investigator had uncovered a massive web of intentional fraud. The application claimed George earned $80,000 in independent consulting fees, a complete fabrication supported by falsified tax summaries. The recovery email address and the primary contact number belonged directly to Beverly. Furthermore, the Internet Protocol address used to submit the digital forgery matched the wireless router inside the townhouse. My mother had not simply forged a signature on a whim. The woman who raised us had engineered a comprehensive financial alias to deliberately bypass the banking security protocols. The undeniable weight of that technical evidence stayed locked inside the prosecutor's office, but a completely different kind of consequence began leaking into the community. A week later, the treasurer of a local charity fund asked my mother to step down from her volunteer board position. Rumors regarding a massive financial separation between my parents had circulated through the Columbus suburbs, and the charity wanted to distance itself from any potential scandal. My phone rang shortly after the board meeting concluded. "You are systematically destroying my reputation," the breathless voice accused through the tiny speaker. "You called the charity committee and poisoned them against me." I looked out my apartment window at the empty parking lot, watching the rain hit the asphalt. "I did not contact anyone," I replied quietly. Beverly scoffed, completely unable to comprehend a reality where consequences arrived without someone actively pulling strings to punish her. She ended the call by slamming her phone down, choosing to believe I was the villain of her story. My sister faced a different kind of public fallout during that same week. Several aunts and cousins completely reversed their positions, suddenly blaming Amber for enabling the deception and protecting the golden child narrative for years. During a quiet meeting at a local diner, Amber stared down at her untouched coffee and accepted the criticism without making a single excuse. She admitted she had enjoyed the elevated status of being the chosen child, and she acknowledged using our mother's lies to make me feel isolated during the holidays. "My apology does not erase 8 years of terrible behavior," Amber said, tracing the rim of her ceramic mug. "But if this goes to trial, I will authenticate those voicemails in front of a judge." "I appreciate that," I told her, picking up my own cup. Earning back my complete trust would take years. Not a single afternoon over coffee, but her willingness to testify against her primary protector marked a genuine shift in our family dynamic. 2 agonizing months dragged by before the civilian prosecutor finally reached a conclusion. Based on the falsified loan application, the blue ledger, and the clear flow of the stolen money, the state determined there was enough concrete evidence to pursue charges for identity fraud and forgery. There was no dramatic raid at the townhouse, and no police cruisers flashed their lights in front of the neighbors. Justice arrived as a quiet, formal notice delivered by certified mail. Beverly retained a defense attorney who arranged for a scheduled surrender and processing. George received the notification through his legal counsel, and the old man simply nodded when he heard the news, looking far older than his 67 years. The reality of a criminal trial finally cornered the woman who raised us, forcing her defense team to seek a desperate alternative before stepping into a courtroom. On a Tuesday morning, Attorney Davis forwarded a formal settlement proposal from opposing counsel. I opened the digital attachment, reading the terms twice to ensure I understood the sheer audacity of the request. Beverly offered to accept full financial responsibility for the fraudulent debt and provide partial restitution for the stolen cash. However, the offer required George, Amber, and me to sign a legally binding statement declaring my mother never possessed malicious intent, essentially asking us to tell one final lie to keep her out of a jail cell. Attorney Davis laid the formal settlement proposal on her polished wooden desk, and the thick cream paper seemed to absorb the faint light filtering through the office blinds. The defense offer demanded a written statement from our family, minimizing the intentional fraud in exchange for a partial financial restitution. My mother wanted to retain a highly favorable division of my father's military pension during the impending divorce proceedings, and she desperately needed us to declare her actions were simply a misunderstanding to keep herself out of a county jail cell. I wanted to push the document right back across the desk and refuse the ridiculous terms immediately. The lawyer raised a manicured hand, instructing me to remain silent and forcing me to listen to the other victims sitting in the room. George stared at the blank signature line for a long time. My father rubbed his temples, and his breathing sounded heavy and ragged in the quiet space. He admitted he did not want to see his wife of 40 years standing in front of a criminal judge, and a large part of his hesitation stemmed from his own deep, suffocating embarrassment. A public trial would expose the absolute reality of their broken marriage to the entire neighborhood, stripping away the peaceful illusion he had maintained for decades. I looked at the exhausted old man sitting beside me and told him that shame could no longer serve as the manager of our family. George slowly nodded, finally agreeing he would not sign a fabricated statement to protect her, but he asked us to support a reasonable plea deal if the prosecutor offered one. Before we officially rejected the proposal, Beverly requested a supervised meeting with her youngest daughter. They met the following morning in a neutral conference room at the local courthouse, with both legal representatives sitting nearby to monitor the exchange. I was not allowed inside the room, so I waited in the cold hallway and listened to the low murmur of voices bleeding through the heavy wooden door. According to the detailed account Amber provided later that afternoon, our mother did not waste a single second offering apologies or taking accountability for the stolen thousands. Beverly immediately launched into a frantic, aggressive negotiation, promising to leave the remainder of her depleted assets entirely to her youngest child if Amber agreed to sign the leniency statement. The woman who raised us leaned across the metal table and claimed I would completely abandon Amber the moment the legal dispute concluded. My mother called me a cold, loveless machine, desperately trying to pull Amber back into the familiar, comfortable role of the chosen child. My sister sat gripping the edge of the table, almost swaying under the immense pressure of losing the only mother she had ever truly known. Then Amber asked a single question that shattered the entire carefully constructed illusion. She looked at the desperate woman across the table and asked why she had always called her the good daughter. Beverly did not offer a motherly reassurance or a tearful declaration of unconditional love. Her expression hardened into a cold, practical mask, completely devoid of maternal warmth. "Because I made you the good daughter," our mother replied, her voice dropping to a flat, venomous whisper. "I gave you a place in this family, and you owe me for it." The title was never a badge of honor or a reflection of genuine affection. It was nothing more than a calculated loyalty debt, minted and distributed to ensure someone would always defend her worst behavior. Amber asked if her mother had ever actually loved her more than she loved me, but Beverly simply refused to answer, repeating that her youngest child owed her a signature. My sister stood up, pushed her heavy chair back, and walked out of the room without touching the pen. Amber found me waiting in the parking lot and relayed the entire terrible conversation while we stood next to my vehicle. The afternoon wind bit through our wool coats, carrying the sharp scent of wet asphalt and impending rain. I did not pull her into a dramatic hug, and I did not offer any empty promises that everything would magically heal overnight. Instead, my sister looked down at the wet pavement and offered a painfully specific apology. Amber apologized for laughing when our mother mocked my military career, for calling me a holiday daughter during Thanksgiving dinners, and for blindly accepting the financial lies without ever asking me for the truth. I accepted her words, and then I delivered my own. I apologized for treating her caregiving efforts as a professional failure, acknowledging that my own arrogant assumptions had pushed her right back into our mother's trap. We finally agreed to cooperate, choosing a fragile, honest alliance over a fake cinematic reconciliation. The three of us authorized Attorney Davis to officially reject the settlement offer the very next morning. We informed the civilian prosecutor we would accept a plea agreement involving verified financial restitution and mandatory counseling, but we absolutely refused to erase the deliberate intent behind the identity theft. Beverly immediately instructed her defense attorney to contest the charges, hoping our family would eventually crumble under the immense pressure of a public courtroom battle. A few hours later, the state prosecutor contacted our legal team with a sobering update regarding their trial strategy. The audio recordings of the online casino games would require formal authentication on the witness stand, meaning my younger sister would have to swear under oath against her own mother in a public forum. I watched Amber process the heavy weight of that requirement. She took a slow, deep breath, and her tense shoulders finally relaxed for the first time in months. "If she takes this to trial," Amber stated quietly, her voice perfectly steady, "I will testify." The civilian prosecutor had successfully built a fortress out of banking paper and digital access logs. Attorney Davis arranged the finalized evidence matrix across her glass conference table on a rainy Tuesday morning, and the sheer volume of the documents left absolutely no room for a plausible defense. We sat in the quiet office, listening to the rain hit the windows, while the lawyer detailed the trap. The stack included the forged loan application, the authenticated device records tying the digital signature directly to the townhouse internet router, and the recovery email histories. Beside those official files lay the blue ledger and the certified transcript of the casino voicemail Amber had bravely surrendered. Confronted with a mountain of undeniable proof and the absolute certainty that her youngest daughter would testify against her under oath, my mother finally realized a public trial would end in total disaster. Her defense attorney contacted the state prosecutor the very next afternoon. Beverly formally agreed to accept a plea deal regarding the identity fraud and the forgery charges to avoid a lengthy trial. However, the woman who raised us still clung to her manufactured reality, insisting to her legal counsel that she had only committed criminal offenses to keep our struggling family afloat. 3 days later, we walked through the heavy security doors of the county courthouse. The massive courtroom smelled faintly of old wood, floor wax, and nervous sweat. My dress uniform felt stiff and heavy across my shoulders as I sat down on the hard wooden gallery bench next to George and Amber. We watched the defense table in complete silence. Beverly stood before the magistrate, wearing a conservative navy sweater, deliberately slumping her shoulders in a calculated display of grandmotherly frailty. The judge spoke with a flat, booming voice that echoed off the high plaster ceiling. He asked if the defendant understood her rights, and he demanded to know if anyone had coerced her into accepting the legal agreement. My mother leaned toward the microphone and whispered her confirmation. A brief burst of static followed her words. The prosecutor stood up and read the factual basis of the charges, stripping away decades of emotional manipulation and reducing 8 years of psychological warfare into cold clinical definitions. Hearing the woman who raised us verbally admit to stealing my father's Social Security number did not trigger any cheers or dramatic gasps in the gallery. A strange, hollow quiet settled over our row as the absolute truth officially entered the permanent public record. George gripped the edge of the wooden pew so tightly his knuckles turned white, and Amber let out a long, shaky breath, finally releasing the tension she had carried for months. The magistrate accepted the plea on the spot, scheduling the formal sentencing hearing for a later date pending a complete restitution calculation. We exited the courtroom, seeking the crisp air of the marble hallway, but the confrontation was far from over. My mother broke away from her defense attorney and intercepted us near the main elevators. Her eyes immediately bypassed me and locked onto her youngest child, completely dropping the frail victim act she had just performed for the judge. Beverly reached out, attempting to grab Amber by the wrist, and demanded a highly favorable victim impact statement. The desperate woman insisted her youngest daughter could still beg the court for extreme leniency. "Tell them Melissa controlled the entire family," Beverly urged, her voice echoing sharply against the cold marble walls. "Tell the judge your sister forced everyone to turn against me. Stand with me right now, or you will become exactly like her." Amber did not shrink back, and she did not look at me for permission to speak. My sister simply took a deliberate step backward, creating a physical boundary between herself and the woman who had weaponized her loyalty for a decade. "You never loved me more than you loved her," Amber said. Her voice remained completely steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the busy courthouse. "You only needed me to believe you did so. I would protect you." The rejection struck Beverly like a physical blow, causing her face to flush a deep crimson. Realizing the chosen child had finally broken free from the narrative, our mother pivoted her furious glare directly toward me. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and loudly accused me of successfully stealing both her daughter and her husband. I did not waste my breath listing the criminal offenses she had just confessed to inside the courtroom. I simply looked at the woman who had spent 15 years convincing me I was an emotional failure because I chose a military career over her conditional approval. "You made us compete for your love for our entire adult lives," I told her, letting the absolute finality of the words settle into the space between us. "Neither of us is bidding anymore." I turned away, reaching out to press the illuminated elevator call button. But George stepped forward to block her path. My father stood taller than he had in years, looking directly at the woman he had married 4 decades ago. Beverly immediately softened her expression, attempting to leverage their shared history by reminding him that 40 years of marriage had to mean something. "It means everything," George replied quietly, his voice cracking just a fraction. "And that is exactly why the betrayal is so severe. I will not ask the prosecutor to seek the maximum sentence, Beverly, but I will absolutely not ask the court to pretend you did not know exactly what you were doing." He informed her that all future communication would go strictly through his divorce attorney, completely severing her final line of control. The heavy metal elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the 3 of us stepped inside together, leaving the architect of our misery standing entirely alone in the hallway. The victory felt strangely heavy during the long drive back to Kentucky. A plea agreement successfully secured her legal accountability, but the judge still needed to determine the exact length of her confinement and the strict terms of her probation. That evening, sitting alone in my dark apartment, I opened my laptop to begin drafting the victim impact statement the prosecutor had requested. The cursor blinked steadily on the bright white screen, waiting for me to summarize a lifetime of emotional theft. I rested my fingers on the cool plastic keyboard and typed a single sentence. "My mother did not steal only money." I stopped typing and stared at the glowing letters. The financial devastation was completely documented and easily quantified, yet I had no idea what kind of punishment to ask the court for, or what pieces of the past I finally needed to let go of to survive the coming sentence. 10 weeks ago, the heavy oak doors of the county courtroom swung shut, sealing out the noise of the public hallway. The sentencing hearing felt entirely different from the plea agreement, and the air inside the chamber hung thick with a heavy, impending finality. We sat in the front row of the gallery, watching the defense table where my mother sat completely rigid in her chair. The bailiff called George Grant to the podium. My father stood up, and his steps were slow but remarkably steady. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand, looking directly at the magistrate rather than his wife of 4 decades. The microphone amplified the slight tremor in his voice as he read from a single sheet of paper. George did not ask the court for vengeance, and he completely refused to demand the maximum penalty. Instead, he spoke about the profound loss of his own name. The old man admitted his decades of passive silence had allowed the deception to fester, taking full responsibility for ignoring the warning signs. Then he formally requested complete financial restitution, mandatory credit repair costs, and a permanent legal barrier preventing his soon-to-be ex-wife from ever accessing his accounts again. When my father finished, he walked back to our bench and sat down, finally exhaling a breath he seemed to have held for 40 years. Amber stepped up to the podium next. My younger sister wore a simple black dress, and she did not bring any notes. She looked across the room at the defense table, meeting our mother's desperate, pleading gaze. Beverly leaned forward, clearly expecting the chosen child to finally beg the judge for mercy. That rescue never arrived. Amber told the court the stolen money was only a fraction of the damage, explaining that the real crime was teaching a daughter that family loyalty required a constant, expensive auction. My sister publicly took responsibility for the years she spent hurting me to maintain her favored status, and she explicitly told the judge she would not ask for leniency just because the defendant happened to be her mother. A suffocating silence settled over the defense table. Beverly stared at Amber, and the terrible realization that she had completely lost her chosen shield finally washed the remaining color from her face. The bailiff called my name, and I took my place behind the microphone. The smooth wood felt cool beneath my palms. I did not mention my military rank, and I did not list the logistical operations I commanded overseas. The court did not need to hear my resume. I looked at the magistrate and admitted my own massive failure. I confessed I had used monthly bank transfers as a convenient shield to avoid difficult family conversations, and I acknowledged that my emotional distance had given the defendant the perfect cover to execute her fraud. I paused, letting the admission settle into the quiet room. But her choice to exploit that distance was entirely her own, I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to the back of the chamber. I did not bring her into this courtroom, Your Honor. I simply stopped standing between her and the consequences of what she did. I requested mandatory counseling and strict financial restitution, clarifying I wanted accountability rather than public humiliation. The magistrate reviewed his extensive notes, and the rhythmic tap of his pen echoed like a metronome. When he finally delivered the sentence, he did not treat the case like a simple family misunderstanding. He noted that advanced age and maternal status did not erase a calculated, prolonged campaign of identity theft. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp crack. Beverly was sentenced to a finite period of confinement in the county facility, followed by several years of strict community control and supervised probation. The court ordered complete financial restitution to George, Amber, and me, mandating every single stolen dollar be accounted for. Furthermore, the judge imposed mandatory gambling addiction treatment and issued a permanent order barring her from ever opening a financial instrument under my father's name. A pair of uniformed deputies approached the defense table to execute the confinement order. Beverly stood up, and her hands trembled wildly. She turned around, scanning the gallery benches with wide, terrified eyes, desperately searching for someone to stand up and object. She looked at George. She looked at Amber. Finally, she looked directly at me. Nobody moved. We simply sat in the wooden pew and watched the deputies escort her through the side door. The immediate aftermath of the sentencing required a massive logistical dismantling of our previous lives. Within a few weeks, George finalized the divorce proceedings. The court forced the sale of several luxury assets Beverly had acquired, routing the settlement funds directly toward the mandated restitution. My father moved out of a temporary hotel and signed a lease for a small practical apartment on the east side of Columbus. He set up automatic alerts for his own rent payments, and he began reading his printed bank statements every single month. Amber enrolled in a weekly support group designed for families untangling themselves from severe emotional manipulation. We did not suddenly become perfect best friends, and we did not pretend the last decade of hostility had vanished overnight. Building a new foundation required absolute patience, so we started with small, cautious texts instead of forced holiday gatherings. That brings us to this exact moment. 2 hours ago, I parked my car in front of my father's new apartment building. I had driven up from Kentucky for a quiet weekend dinner, marking exactly 10 weeks since the heavy courtroom doors closed. The small dining table barely fit the three of us, and the apartment smelled like roasted chicken and fresh lemon polish. There were no grand speeches about forgiveness, and nobody offered a tearful toast to new beginnings. We simply passed the plates and talked about the terrible autumn weather. When we finished eating, Amber stood up and began clearing the dishes. She looked directly at me, holding a stack of ceramic plates. "Do you want some pie now, or do you want to wait a while?" my sister asked. She did not ask our father to relay the message, and she did not assume she already knew the answer. It was a completely ordinary, direct question, representing the kind of basic communication our family was finally learning how to practice. I told her I would wait, and she nodded, carrying the plates into the small kitchen. George sat across from me, wearing a comfortable flannel shirt. He pulled a folded bank statement from his pocket, adjusted his reading glasses, and carefully reviewed the printed lines. He did not ask me to verify the math, and he did not hand the paper over for my approval. He simply read his own financial history, folded the document back up, and placed it safely inside his wallet. Earlier this afternoon, before arriving at the apartment, I had stopped by Attorney Davis's office to drop off a final piece of paperwork. I handed over the metal keys to the old townhouse, officially closing the estate portion of the divorce. While sitting in the waiting room, I checked my phone and found a new voicemail trapped in my filtered messages folder. The county facility allowed inmates limited phone privileges, and Beverly had used her allotted time to call my number. Her voice sounded thin and strained over the poor connection. She did not ask how I was doing, and she did not inquire about George or Amber. She simply explained that the facility commissary was quite expensive, and she asked if I could help out with one final small transfer to make her stay a little more comfortable. I listened to the recording twice, sitting in the quiet law office. I did not feel the familiar spike of anger, and I did not feel a crushing wave of guilt. I simply saved the audio file and forwarded it to the attorney for the official record. Then I opened my banking application, navigated to the recurring payments menu, and permanently deleted her profile from my payee list. I closed the application, turned off the screen, and walked out into the crisp Ohio air without returning the call. For 15 years, I had believed duty meant carrying whatever weight my family handed me. I finally understood that some burdens were not mine to carry. I had not abandoned my family. I had stopped paying for a place inside it. 6 months after the heavy courtroom doors closed, I stood on the small concrete balcony of my father's new apartment. The harsh Ohio winter had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp early spring afternoon. My father knelt on a thin foam pad, carefully packing dark, rich soil around the base of a young perennial plant in a heavy terracotta pot. He had taken up urban container gardening shortly after the divorce was finalized. He told me he specifically chose low-maintenance perennials because they establish deep roots and come back entirely on their own without needing to be forced or constantly manipulated to survive. I watched his weathered hands, the exact same hands that had trembled while signing the identity theft report, gently tamping down the dirt. He was building something small, something he could actually manage himself. He did not need anyone to hide the receipts, and he did not need a wife to translate the world for him anymore. George brushed the soil from his palms, stood up slowly, and handed me a glass of iced tea he had prepared himself. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from Amber. It was not a manufactured crisis, and it was not a hostile message passed through a third party. It was just a photograph of a coffee cup sitting on her desk at the physical therapy clinic, followed by a simple question asking if I was driving up for the long weekend in May. I typed back a simple yes, hit send, and slid the phone away. There was no money exchanged. There was no guilt required to secure an invitation. For my entire adult life, I genuinely believed love was a ledger. I thought every relationship possessed a hidden balance sheet, and if I just kept my account in the black by paying the rent and solving the logistical problems, I would eventually earn a permanent place at the table. When the woman who raised us was finally removed from the center of our lives and confined to a county facility, I expected our entire family structure to collapse into absolute dust. It did not collapse. It simply shrank down to its actual, honest sighs. We were no longer a grand, sprawling theatrical production putting on a flawless show for the neighborhood charity boards. We were just a father tending to his balcony plants, and two sisters slowly learning how to text each other without bracing for an emotional impact. The silence in the family was no longer a weapon used to divide us. The silence was just peace. I leaned against the cool metal railing of the balcony and took a deep breath of the fresh spring air. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for 15 years was entirely gone. I did not win a glorious war, and I certainly did not fix my mother. I just walked away from the auction block. Sometimes the only way to survive a rigged game is to simply stop funding the house. I look back at that expensive, polished dining table from 13 months ago, and I constantly wonder how many other people are sitting in a chair just like mine. How many of you are quietly funding your own heartbreak, desperately hoping the very next deposit will be the one that finally buys you a real family? Tell me, what was the exact moment you finally closed your checkbook and walked out the door? When you listen to a story like this, you might feel a familiar, uncomfortable knot tightening in your own stomach. You might recognize the heavy, suffocating pressure of being the designated family rescuer, the capable adult who is expected to solve every domestic crisis with a quick bank transfer while accepting quiet insults as your only payment. It is incredibly easy to confuse profound financial abuse with basic family duty, especially when the manipulation comes from the very people who raised you. You have to learn how to identify the subtle mechanics of this exploitation before it completely drains your own future. Financial abuse within a family rarely looks like an outright theft. It almost always disguises itself as a sudden medical emergency, a tragic rent crisis, or a desperate plea to help a struggling parent save face. The most critical lesson you can take away from this story is the absolute necessity of financial transparency. If a family member demands that you keep your financial support a secret from your siblings or your other parent, you are not protecting their dignity. You are actively funding a system of deception. Real family support requires verifiable proof. You have every right to demand a look at the actual lease agreement, the physical medical bills, and the joint bank statements before you hand over a single dollar. If asking for basic proof triggers a massive guilt trip or an aggressive tantrum, you are being manipulated. You also must learn to recognize the devastating, isolating trap of sibling triangulation. A manipulative parent maintains absolute control by keeping their children in a constant state of emotional competition. They create a golden child and a scapegoat, feeding each of you different, conflicting narratives to ensure you remain angry at each other. They tell you that your sister is selfish, and they tell your sister that you are heartless, guaranteeing that the two of you never sit down to compare your bank statements. The only way to break this toxic cycle is to stop using your parent as the sole source of truth. The moment you pick up the phone and speak directly to your sibling, the entire manufactured war falls apart. Setting hard boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is a required act of self-preservation. You must protect your own identity by actively monitoring your credit reports, locking your credit profile if you suspect unauthorized loans, and refusing to enable illegal behavior just to keep the peace at the holiday dinner table. You do not owe your financial security to a mother or a father who treats your loyalty like an endless line of credit. Walking away from that toxic auction block does not mean you have abandoned your family. It means you have finally accepted that genuine love cannot be purchased, and you have stopped paying for a place inside a house that was built on lies. You might be sitting there right now, carrying a massive, secret financial burden because you are terrified of the fallout if you finally say no. How many times have you transferred money from your own hard-earned savings, silently hoping that this final payment would be the one that finally earns you a little genuine respect? What was the exact moment you realized your family was treating your love as a calculated transaction? And how did you finally find the courage to close your checkbook and walk away? Please share your story in the comments below.